Our next speaker is Dr. Paula Meek. Dr. Meek is the Assistant Dean for the PhD program at the University of Utah. Dr. Meek has investigated symptom appraisal, treatment, and management for over 20 years and specialized in longitudinal measurement of instruments used to evaluate symptoms in both chronic and acute phases of illness. Dr. Meek is a fellow in the American Thoracic Society and has been a member of 5 expert panels of the American Thoracic Society and a systematic review panel. In addition, she is on the editorial board of Nursing Research, Chronic Respiratory Disease Journal, and the Chronic Obstructive Pulmonary Disease Journal of the COPD Foundation. Dr. Meek has taught at 4 colleges of nursing and led 2 PhD programs and helped develop another. She also served on the board for Nexus, the Nursing Education Exchange, which is a consortium of institutions that offer online doctoral programs in nursing that provide opportunities for students to take courses from other member institutions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Meek.
My agenda is very simple. I'm just going to go over some social determinants overview from the standpoint of getting us all on the same page, not that you don't understand those. In many ways, probably some of you understand them better than I, and basic symptom tenets, and then provide some examples from my work, and then social determinants and symptoms, and provide examples from my work as well as some recent literature work that I think will be interesting to you. Having said that about examples, I want to just give another little bit of a caveat. And in my search, not only in pulmonary or cardiac symptoms, I will tell you that social determinants and symptom linkages are somewhat haphazardly made. There are some that really come out, and I'm going to try and point those out, but many have just been sort of serendipitous findings. And then we will move into stepping forward in what we do now, measurement and some model issues. So social determinants. I want to use 2 agencies to try and illustrate some of the key points about social determinants that I'm going to try and focus on. And this is the World Health Organization's definition that many of you are probably familiar with, that social determinants are non-medical factors that will influence health outcomes, and they're the result of condition. The key ones that they emphasize are economic, policy, and systems development agencies, social norms, social policies, and political systems. And I think this adds a little bit more of a nuance to some of the definitions of social determinants that I'd like to emphasize going forward. These are the statistics they have right on their website of that 100% of low-educated subgroups report 100% more poor health than tertiary education. And I don't know about you, but anything that is 100%, I pay attention to because I've never got 100% of anything to work mostly. And that individuals born in countries that have low social determinants of health have 19 fewer years to live. So those of us in the US and developed countries live 19 years longer. That's a staggering amount. And then the areas that were deprived areas across the world have had double the incidence and mortality rates of COVID, which is a staggering thought. This is the CDC definition and the one that's in the Healthy People 2030, and that I will use as a bit of a framework. And most of you have seen this. I just want to highlight their definitions a little bit of these 5 categories. And it is very similar in that it are conditions in the places where people live, work, learn, play that will affect their health and quality of life risks and outcomes. If we look at the education, basically they're going to emphasize the amount of education the individual has and the access to that, as well as attaining general language and literacy skills. And health literacy in general, we've all been paying a lot more attention to that over the most recent years, but that in particular can have a huge impact on symptom appraisal. Healthcare access and quality, we all know about these issues. They become very blatant through the COVID-19. And access to primary care, health insurance coverage, and health literacy also. And then when we move into neighborhoods and and buildings, we're very focused on housing, transportation, healthy food, air, and water quality. And air quality is something I have gotten into, not because I was clearly thinking in terms of social determinants, but was thinking in terms of exposure with respiratory disease, and then also crime and violence. Social and community contexts, we're going to be thinking about cohesion within the community, discrimination, conditions in the workplace, and incarceration, as you probably aware. And then economic stability is a big one. It's a big one right now, potentially with all of our potential participants. And that is because of the inflation, the things that are going on, the supply chain issues. And basically, you want to think in terms of poverty, employment, food security, and housing stability, which is the keys there. And what I'd like to do is use these definitions to kind of frame within the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities research paradigm that they have, or framework that they have put forth, and that has been out there for, since 2018. So a while, and many people are responding to it. But what I like about it is that the social determinants of health, we really have to think about at being at many levels of influence. And even when a symptom, which I'll talk about in a minute, is a very individual thing, there are implications from a community and population health issue that need to be addressed. And that's where some of the social determinants will come in, particularly air quality. That is a key one that you can think of from that standpoint, or water quality, as has been being faced by some in the Northeast. So symptoms, we definitely need to focus on this individual level, both biologic, which the P30 is doing exceptionally well, and behavioral and physical built environments. The person's environment really makes a difference. And social cultural environment is a critical one. We know this from just the simple thing of trying to measure a symptom in the same way across cultural identities, across limited English. But one thing that I would say I am not sure we've totally responded to is discrimination, and how that might potentially be impacting the symptoms that are reported. We had a very stark example through COVID of a Black physician who was talking about her symptoms and were clearly ignored and ended up succumbing to COVID. And I'm sure you are all aware of that incident. And then insurance coverage, health literacy, obviously. These are obvious how they are going to link to symptoms in many ways, although many of them have not been studied. And what also has not been looked at very effectively is all of the interactions that are potential across these different domains of influence. The other thing that is a little more obvious is some of the interpersonal, like the caregiver, family microbiome, family functioning. Those kinds of things can dramatically influence some of the symptoms that we see, as well as social networks. And that clearly has not been studied much related to symptoms. Okay, and so we'll talk more about some of these, and I'm going to try and emphasize some of the examples that I have found in the literature related to community and population health to try and stretch our thought processes here. So now, in talking to symptoms, this is the Leventhal model of illness representation that really spawned much of my work. And the important part that I want to focus on here is the stimulus portion, or the stimuli, is what has to occur. Now, multiple of the population and community things can affect that stimulus, but the important part of that is processing of the system within the person is what gives rise to what they might call a symptom. Now, in Leventhal's model, what he basically talks about is the illness in general. And what I have done is try to focus on the symptoms, because they will undergo the same process. They will be evaluated within their representation, the person's representation of the illness, and then also are related to emotional reactions and or emotional state that might be occurring. Now, the key part of that I want to talk about is how we need to be very clear about the stimulus and the response. And the stimulus and the response occur to then label the symptom, and that requires a perception of that sensation, which is labeled as abnormal or dangerous. And that is particularly important when we get into talking about chronic conditions, because there, as you probably are well aware, there is this feeling that many people with chronic conditions over several years will minimize some of the sensations or have modulated those sensations so that they don't always call them symptoms, even though they may have a sensation that hasn't really changed much. Their perception of it has changed. It has not. So this is the cycle I like to think in terms of the sensation, the awareness, the internal assessment, and then the appraisal based on stored information, and then the perception. But this is a nice process, but what you cannot do is think of it as stagnant. It obviously has to keep going as far as appraisal, stored information. The person is continuously assessing it. You know this from yourself. You have any kind of symptom, maybe you even simple symptoms of a blister or something of that, where you're having pain from that. You will continually assess that until it does not become an issue for you. So the key factors of symptoms that I'm going to focus on is that they have to be dynamic, and that whether you have an acute or a chronic symptom, you have life experiences that are going to cause you to interpret it and determine whether it's abnormal, whether it is basically something you need to deal with, or whether it's just part of your life, if you will. And those are the things, I argue, those life experiences where social determinants have the biggest impact in symptom appraisal. And we have not looked at how those, in many settings and in many ways, looked at how those impact. With chronic illness, symptoms serve as a signal that something's gone wrong, the management is not working, or that the disease has progressed, or that they need additional medical attention. So it has even a different flavor relative to that. And it is a necessary thing to a precursor to seeking care. I don't know many people who show up in the ER because they don't have a symptom they're going to report, or many people who show up at their doctor who don't have something that they want to talk about. And most of the time it's a symptom. So I'm going to use examples from pulmonary now to illustrate some of those points in a little bit different. This is an old physiologic diagram from Adams and Guz. And if you're in pulmonary, those are pretty famous physiologists who have impacted this. And what is key here is you notice that we have the chemoreceptors, both periphery and medullary. We also have respiratory muscles to send signals, and actually the lungs tend to send the signal. Those all go through either the brainstem or to the sensory cortex, and that gives rise to the sensation. But what we don't often do, or what no sensation arises to a symptom without the association cortex, thoughts and experience, and without the limbic system being triggered at some point. And that's the emotions that can get, that are incorporated fully within the symptom that is reported. So not only their thoughts and experiences, but their emotion. So when someone is asked about how their symptom is or what brought them in to see the doctor, they will describe the situation. They won't just say, well, I have this shortness of breath, or I have this pain. They will describe about that. That's their thoughts and experiences that have been prioritized for them. Now, my example is really old from my work. In fact, it's my dissertation work where I did some magnitude estimation. And if you want to know more about what that is, we can talk about it later. It was very in fashion when I was there. But bottom line, what we're trying to do is give the individual a range of sensations or stimulus that then should give how they would respond to lesser and greater stimulus of impedance to breathing is the one that I used. And I did it in individuals who had COPD and then age and matched gender controls who were healthy. And basically what you get is an exponent, which is like a slope on a regression curve. So it tells you where they are at as far as their response to all those stimuli. And what I did in my dissertation was simply to ask them very clear, to remember their very clearest memory of breathlessness. I didn't say shortness of breath. I didn't say anything. I just a time where you noticed your breathing and you felt breathless. And what you can see from the red lines is that if you look at the mean, in general, there was a difference and the COPD responded greater. But the thing I really want to point out that totally went past me, I was just happy to have a difference between the two groups, is how disparate the healthy group was. If you focus on their lines from when it was in a control condition to when it was in a memory condition, you can see some individuals where it dramatically increased in very stark ways. You can also see individuals where it started high, probably because of the condition I had induced, and then it calmed down. Maybe they knew of times or ways, and it came into their reporting of those symptoms that helped them understand how to control or how to mitigate the situation. So basically, that led me to trying to evaluate breathlessness a little bit more using visual analogs and using it from the standpoint of two visual analog scales, which work very effectively in individuals looking at breathing. And I tried to separate the effort associated with their breathing and the distress associated with their breathing. And what we found is if you look at that in healthy COPD or asthma, what this is showing is the confidence interval, if you will, around the mean, around effort in the black and distress in the white. And you can see that no matter which category of participants you look at, that there's a huge range there, a little like what we saw with the magnitude estimation. While the central mean may be different, the variation is not. And my point again is, I believe that the social determinants, their life experiences, their conditions that they live, the support that they may have felt in the past helps determine where they are on that range. That led me to my next study where I was really trying to understand symptom self-management. But you can see I haven't learned yet about social determinants in a clear way because I was still incredibly focused on disease severity, cognitive function, and symptom intensity. Not that that's a bad thing. That's why I'm calling it evolutionary. I have learned. But you can see that the only place that anything related to social determinants could be coming in here is essentially relative to the distress associated with their breathing. Technically, the social determinants is implied in the spirometry measures. For those of you not familiar, those are standardized based on age, race, height, those kinds of things. So because they're standardized, we tend to think of those as neutral, but some of that standardization it has been proven wrong in the years. So I show you these models, not that they are great models, but to simply show you where we could have improved these things. There's so much more in symptom self-management, such as, besides the care seeking, caregiving, their home environment, external exposures, all of those kinds of things. But what we followed them over a month and asked them to do the effort and distress. And what we clearly found were these variations. This is in all COPD patients, mostly moderate to severe COPD. And the purple line indicates the effort, and the distress is in the dark brownish line. And the difference between them on any given day is what I want you to focus on. So their effort could be the same at 2 time points, but the distress, the distress may be much lower or much higher. Those are points of investigation that I tried to capture with notes, but really did not capture sufficiently and potentially should have to understand what was impacting that distress associated with that symptom. They could have high effort, as you see in the high purple point and on day 6, but lower distress, or they could have higher distress and lower effort. Those are missed opportunities that I regret now. I wasn't aware, but I am now. And the other thing that I would like to just show you is that variability only correlated with trait anxiety that I was measuring at the time. And so it does show that anxiety, the trait for anxiety, if you will, from the state trait anxiety tool, potentially can impact the geriatric depression scale, which is on the far right of the screen. It didn't correlate with anything. Somatization out of the brief symptom inventory did correlate with all of the actual mean and greatest, but really depression and anxiety were very low in comparison as far as correlations with this. The trait of somatization is a critical one for understanding how people interpret. It tells us how sensitive they are to changes in their system. And we've all seen individuals who potentially we think of as being overly sensitive to those things. The trick here is to understand what goes into that sensation. The other part of that study was to look at how that really impacted seeking care. And here's what I will say to you. You can see that healthy individuals, it took a change from their norm of almost 6 points to seek care, where asthma, it took a change of about 5 points, but COPD, it still took about 3 points change for them to seek care. Now, I focused on the amount of change it took for COPD because I was trying to get them to seek care earlier, whatever kind of care that was. But the important part of this is the difference between those two, what their norm is and how big of a change. And it tells me that this is reflective of not only their condition and their life experiences, but potentially it has implications relative to their healthcare access and to their healthcare their relationship with their healthcare provider. Some of those individuals clearly sought care, both in COPD and asthma earlier, but basically on a scale of 1 to 10, or 0 to 10, most people are not going to seek care until they get way above the median. But the critical feature here is what things are going into that decision of seeking care, and it is never just the symptom. So I want to draw you back to some history, and we go back to Florence many times, but this quote from Florence's Notes on Nursing, which is right in the beginning of it, is critically important, I think, right now for us to think about. In watching diseases, both in private houses and public houses, the thing which strikes the experienced observer most forcefully is that the symptom or the suffering generally considered to be inevitable and incident to the disease are often not symptoms of the disease at all, but of something quite different. Fresh air or light or warmth or quiet or cleanliness or punctuality of care or diet. If those aren't social determinants of health, and she identified it way before I even was as aware of it as I am now, I'm using this for me to try and guide my approach to symptoms in the relationship to social determinants going forward. So I'm going to give you my one example where I say I really consciously sort of looked at something that could be called social determinants, but being rooted in physiology, I definitely looked at it, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying I definitely looked at it from a very classic standpoint. I looked at the environment, their smoking history, whether they were currently smoking, wood smoke exposure, which is a big thing in the West. I'm sure it is in all parts of the country, really, and particularly in some of the rural areas, and obesity. And I looked at the epigenetic impact and how that would affect health status. I was fortunate to be in New Mexico, where there was a lot of individuals who had exposures of these kinds, and just by their normal life, and then also working with the Lovelace Institute that would help with the epigenetic examination of what was going on. So I used the Lovelace Smokers Cohort, which came out of the National Smoking, I forget what they call that now. It was a long time ago. Many of you may not even know about it, but when all of the lieutenant governors got together and started to sue the smoking companies for some of their deceptive practices, and there were a lot of huge settlements. Well, in New Mexico, that settlement was used to help develop this Lovelace Smokers Cohort. And anyone who was participated in that had to at least have a 10-pack year history of smoking. We measured quality of life. And then in the second phase of what I'm going to show you, I used that to try and do some characterization of that population, using activity, symptoms, and impact. So the first thing we did was do some methylation, examination of the GATA4 gene and methylation. And basically, in that case, we found that in the sputum, the GATA4 gene is methylated. It has a direct, most of you probably don't know a lot about pulmonary methylation, but this has a direct implication in the damage that's actually done in the lung. And so I was able to say to this group, we need to look at how that impacts quality of life. And the interesting thing I'm trying to show you here is it clearly impacted the total score activity, and the activity that was going on, and the impact subscale, but it did not. Its odds ratio was non-significant for symptoms. So it basically had the biggest impact, or the biggest odds ratio was in impact, which to me is pretty insightful of that these gene methylations, we've come to understand now, this was back in 2014, but we've come to understand now that they clearly have more than just one site thing. They will turn something off or on. In this case, it turns something on, and it has more broader impacts than just, say, in the lung, if you will. And all of these were controlled for the obvious things that you would think of. I then went the next step and did some latent class solution to try and look at creating some phenotypes of this based on the quality of life score. And I was fortunate enough to come up with 4 phenotypes. There is, if you focus on the top black one, that is where symptoms are high, and they have very limited activity. And then if you look at the red one, that's the low one, where symptoms are relatively low and very minimal impact in the symptoms. And remember, these are all individuals who have at least a 10-pack year, may not have COPD, but are a 10-pack year exposure. And then we have this dotted line where we have high symptoms, very high symptoms of cough, phlegm, and relatively high shortness of breath, but wheeze even drops down, and then go into very minimal impact in walking or in labor, and in impact, sleep, exhaustion, effort, and overall impact is very low. So high symptoms, low impact, and that was also about a third of the group. And then we have this sort of middle group that's high shortness of breath, and limited activity. And so the important part of defining these by how they answered their health-related quality of life is then to take the next step and look at the classification